You don't belong in this boardroom. Sit down before you embarrass your mother." Richard Calloway didn't look up from his papers when he said it. He was 61 years old, managing partner of Calloway Whitmore LLP, a man who had 17 framed certificates on his wall and a habit of checking his watch while other people were still speaking. He had been doing this for 31 years. He was very good at it. The woman he said it to was 26 years old. Her name was Sable Osei. She was wearing a blazer she had borrowed from her neighbor because her own was at the dry cleaner and she hadn't had the money to pick it up this week. The borrowed blazer was a half size too large. The sleeves fell past her wrists. She did not pull them up. She stood at the end of the conference table with a thin folder under one arm and her hands at her sides, and she did not move. To understand what was about to happen in that room on the 14th floor of a glass tower in downtown Toronto, you have to go back 8 months. Back to a small apartment above a convenience store on Danforth Avenue, where a 26-year-old woman was already awake at 5 in the morning, sitting on the floor because her desk had been repossessed along with everything else when her father's business collapsed, reading the Ontario Securities Act by the light of her phone. Sable Osei's mother, Comfort, had cleaned office buildings in the financial district for 19 years. She worked the overnight shift, 4 buildings, finishing at 6 in the morning, stopping at a Tim Hortons on her way home. To bring back 2 coffees she couldn't really afford. She would set one on the kitchen floor beside her daughter and say nothing, because Sable was always reading, and Comfort had learned not to interrupt reading. Sable had been reading since she was 4. By the time she was 16, she was doing the books for 3 small businesses on the street where they lived. By 22, she had finished a finance degree at Ryerson on a combination of scholarships and overnight shifts at a grocery distribution warehouse, working Thursdays through Saturdays so she could attend class Monday through Wednesday. She graduated with honors. She applied to 41 firms in Bay Street. 7 replied. 3 offered interviews. 1 offered a position. The position was junior analyst at a mid-size investment advisory firm called Mercer Capital Group, which was not Bay Street, but was close enough that Comfort cried a little on the bus home after Sable told her. Sable had been at Mercer 11 months when she found the discrepancy. It was in the pension fund audit of a seniors residence chain called Hartwell Living. Mercer had been retained as independent advisor to the Hartwell board, overseeing the management of the employee pension fund. 412 workers, most of them personal support workers and dietary aides and maintenance staff who had been contributing to this fund for anywhere from 3 to 22 years. The fund was administered by an external manager. The external manager was a firm called Northgate Capital Partners. Northgate's senior partner was a man named Dale Firth. Dale Firth had been Richard Calloway's university roommate for 4 years at Western. The discrepancy Sable found was not accidental. It had been built into the quarterly rebalancing reports with enough technical complexity to be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look, and patient enough to spend 40 hours looking. Sable knew where to look because she had spent 3 weeks the previous year writing a research paper on common pension mismanagement patterns, unpaid, on her own time, because she thought she might need to know it someday. She ran the numbers 4 times. Then she ran them a 5th time with a different methodology to make sure she wasn't constructing the answer she expected. She was not. Over the course of 6 years, through a series of fee structures and allocation decisions that were technically within the fine print of the management agreement, but were functionally self-serving, Northgate Capital had quietly redirected approximately $4.3 million in compounded returns away from the Hartwell Pension Fund and into a parallel fund that benefited Northgate's own investors. 412 people who made a median wage of $31,000 a year had been slowly, legally, expertly robbed. Sable sat with this for 3 days. She ate very little. She slept in short intervals on the couch. She went back to the numbers compulsively, the way you go back to a bruise to check whether it still hurts. It still hurt. On the 3rd night, she called her supervisor, a man named Douglas Park, and told him what she had found. Douglas Park told her to document it carefully and bring it to the Monday meeting. He sounded tired. He told her good work. He did not sound surprised. On Monday morning, she brought the analysis to the meeting. Douglas Park was not there. In his place sat Richard Calloway, who had called an unscheduled review of the Hartwell file. Calloway was not Sable's supervisor or her supervisor's supervisor. He was a senior partner at a separate firm. His presence in this room had no formal explanation. He sat at the head of the table in a gray suit that cost more than Sable's monthly rent, and he looked at the junior analyst at the far end of the table, the way men like him sometimes look at things that have appeared in places they shouldn't be. Sable placed her folder on the table and asked to present her findings. Calloway said, "You don't belong in this boardroom. Sit down before you embarrass your mother." He did not know her mother's name. He did not know anything about her mother. It was the kind of thing people like Calloway said when they wanted to locate a person in a category and keep them there. It had worked 31 years of Mondays. It worked on most people. Sable sat down. She set her folder flat on the table in front of her. She did not open it. She looked at the window behind Calloway's head, at the gray February sky above the financial district, and she breathed once, slowly, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when something made her want to cry in front of people who didn't deserve her tears. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. Calloway summarized the Hartwell file in terms that made no reference to the discrepancy. He used phrases like fiduciary complexity and within the parameters of the agreement and industry standard allocation strategy. 2 other people in the room took notes. One of them was a lawyer. Neither of them looked at Sable. At minute 17, Calloway mentioned that the junior analyst had flagged some computational concerns, which the senior team would of course review through the appropriate internal process. He said, "Computational concerns the way you say something that means nothing." He looked at his watch while he said it. After the meeting, in the elevator, a woman named Joanne Leclerc, 38, a compliance officer who had been at Mercer for 6 years, stepped in beside Sable. Joanne did not work on the Hartwell file. She had been in the meeting because someone had added her to the calendar invitation 2 hours beforehand, and she had not known why until she heard Calloway redirect the table away from what the junior analyst had found. Joanne did not say anything in the elevator. When the doors opened on the ground floor, she stepped out, then paused. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out a business card, and held it toward Sable without quite looking at her. "That name," she said. "He's retired. He used to audit pension fund managers for the Ontario Securities Commission. He doesn't owe anyone on Bay Street anything anymore." She walked out. The card said Bernard Atchison, CPA, a phone number and an address in Etobicoke. Sable stood in the lobby for a full minute. The revolving door pushed cold air at her. She put the card in the inside pocket of the borrowed blazer, against her ribs. That night in the apartment on Danforth, Comfort came home at 6:15 with 2 coffees, and found her daughter still awake at the kitchen table, not reading, just sitting. She set the coffee down. She sat across from her. She looked at her daughter's face. "Tell me," she said. Sable told her. Comfort listened the whole way through without speaking. When Sable finished, Comfort was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who are the 412 people?" Sable told her that too. Support workers, dietary staff, the woman who brings the trays, the man who fixes the boiler. People who had been putting money aside for 30 years, expecting it to be there. Comfort wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She had been one of those people once, before the company she worked for restructured, and the pension vanished into the administrative procedures of an asset sale that no one fully explained. She understood the numbers. Sable was describing not as an abstraction, but as something that happened to specific people in specific apartments on specific nights. When they opened a letter and found out the future they had been building had a hole in it they hadn't been told about. "Then you know what you're doing," Comfort said. "It could cost me the job." "I know." "It could cost more than the job." Comfort looked at her for a long moment. Then she got up, went to the cupboard above the refrigerator, and brought down a small tin. Inside the tin were a number of things. A folded piece of paper that was Sable's first report card, a photograph of Comfort's own mother standing in front of a house in Accra, and a laminated clipping from a community newspaper. The clipping was from 2009. The headline read, "Community accountant recovers $180,000 in misfilled benefits for veteran families." The man in the photograph was tall, wearing glasses, standing beside 3 elderly women who were smiling. "Your grandfather," Comfort said, "drove a cab for 20 years and did free accounting for veterans on the weekends. They told him he wasn't a real accountant because he didn't have the Canadian credential yet. He did it anyway." She placed the clipping on the table between them. "He used to say, 'The number doesn't care who found it.'" Sable looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at the card from Joanne Leclerc, Then she picked up her phone and sent a message to a number she had never contacted before. The reply came at 7:53 the next morning. It said, "I know who you are. I've been expecting someone to find this eventually. Come Tuesday, any time after noon. Bring everything you have." Bernard Atchison's house was a semi-detached brick bungalow in Etobicoke, with a driveway full of recycling bins and a maple tree that was still bare in February. He opened the door before Sable knocked, which meant he had seen her coming up the walk. He was in his mid-70s, compact and deliberate, with the kind of stillness that accumulates in people who have spent decades working with documents that other people preferred to keep buried. He looked at her for a moment on the doorstep. "You're younger than I expected," he said. Sable stood straight. "I have everything with me." Bernard stepped back from the door. The dining room table was already clear, which suggested he had made space for this on purpose. He poured tea without asking. He sat across from her and said, "Show me." She showed him. All of it. The quarterly reports, the rebalancing logs, the fee disclosure statements, the parallel fund structure, the methodology she had used to isolate the discrepancy, the 5 different approaches she had run to confirm it. Bernard did not speak while she walked him through it. He looked at every page with the unhurried focus of a man who has no reason to hurry and every reason to be accurate. Twice he asked her to go back 1 page. Once he asked her to explain her methodology on the 3rd calculation in detail, and she did, and he nodded slowly when she finished. Then he sat back. He laced his fingers together on the table. "Do you know why nobody found this before?" "Because you have to understand what's not there," Sable said. "The fee structure is technically disclosed, but the disclosure assumes you'll compare it against industry standard rates, and the comparison category is defined in a subsection of the management agreement in language that most analysts would read as regulatory boilerplate." Bernard looked at her for a moment. "How long have you been doing this?" 11 months. He was quiet. Then he said, "The man who designed that structure is very good. He's also been doing this to 3 other funds I'm aware of. I've been watching for 4 years. I didn't have the internal documents." He nodded at her folder. "You do." He agreed to provide an expert affidavit. He agreed to connect her with a contact at the Ontario Securities Commission's Enforcement Division, a woman he trusted named Karen Vidal. He told Sable to document every interaction with Calloway and anyone at Mercer from this point forward. He told her to keep a separate record and not to store it on any device connected to the firm's network. She was at his door by 9 in the evening. The street outside was quiet. Snow had started falling lightly on the bare maple tree. Bernard walked her to the front step. "Your grandfather," he said without explanation, looking at the street. "He did the books for 6 families on my block when I first moved here. He never charged. He always brought tea." He paused. He used to say, "They think accuracy is a credential. It isn't. It's a character." He looked at her. "I thought you should know he said that." Sable did not ask how Bernard Atchison had known her grandfather. She only looked at him for a moment and nodded, and walked to the bus stop carrying everything she had brought with her, plus something she hadn't brought. The following 3 weeks were the hardest of her life. She worked her regular hours at Mercer, completed her assigned files, said nothing unusual to anyone, and kept her face neutral in every meeting the way you keep your face neutral when you're sitting on something that is pressing upward from the inside. Twice she passed Richard Calloway in the hallway. Once he walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture. Once he stopped, looked at her with an expression of mild calculation, and said he hoped she was finding her footing. She said she was. He moved on. His shoes cost more than her grandfather's cab license. She met with Karen Vidal at the OSC twice off-site, in a coffee shop near St. Clair Station that Karen had chosen specifically because no one from Bay Street ate there. Karen was in her 40s, methodical, with the quality of someone who has heard many things said with great confidence and learned to wait for the paper that supports it. She asked Sable questions for 2.5 hours. At the end of the second meeting, she said, "This is real. It's also bigger than Hartwell." She paused. "There are going to be people who try to make this about you. Your age, your experience, where you work, where you come from. Don't let them." She closed her notebook. "The paper doesn't care about any of that." At night, on the floor of the apartment on Danforth, because she still didn't have a desk, Sable prepared for what she knew was coming. She ran mock cross-examinations in her head, lying on the kitchen floor with her notes on her chest, until the counter-arguments felt less like attacks and more like moves in a sequence she already knew. She recorded herself explaining the discrepancy 11 times until she could do it in 4 minutes without losing a single decimal. She wrote down every question she expected Calloway or his counsel to ask, and she answered everyone in writing. And she checked the answers against the documents, and she answered them again. On the kitchen wall above the toaster, the newspaper clipping from 2009 had been taped up where Comfort could see it from the sink. On a Tuesday morning in March, the Ontario Securities Commission opened a formal review of Northgate Capital Partners' management of the Hartwell Living Pension Fund. It was not the kind of thing that appeared in the news initially. It appeared in a single paragraph in the Financial Services newsletter that circulated to compliance officers and regulatory analysts. Joanne Leclerc read it on her phone at 7:45 in the morning in the parking garage of the Mercer Capital building. She sat in her car for 4 minutes before she went inside. Richard Calloway was informed of the OSC review by his counsel at 9:30 that morning. He was informed 30 minutes later that the triggering documentation had been submitted by an analyst at Mercer Capital Group. His counsel did not tell him the name, but Calloway already knew. He had known since the Monday meeting in February, when a junior analyst in a borrowed blazer had placed a thin folder on the conference table and not opened it. He had assumed she would be managed. He had been wrong. What followed happened with the particular speed of things that have been building for a long time. Within a week, the OSC Enforcement Division had issued a formal request for documents from Northgate Capital Partners. Within 2 weeks, the Hartwell Board had retained independent legal counsel and suspended their management agreement. Dale Firth placed 2 phone calls to Richard Calloway over the course of 4 days. Calloway returned neither of them. There was a hearing. It was not in a courtroom. It was in a boardroom on the 3rd floor of the OSC offices on Queen Street, and it was attended by Calloway, Firth, their respective counsel, 3 OSC enforcement officers, Karen Vidal, Bernard Atchison, and Sable Osei. Sable was not testifying as an employee of Mercer Capital Group. She had resigned 2 weeks earlier. She had been asked to stay on the understanding that her position would be reviewed. She had thanked Douglas Park for the conversation and handed in her key card. Douglas Park had the look of a man who wanted to say something and had not yet decided what. She testified for 47 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not use hedging language. She walked the panel through the discrepancy, the same way she had walked Bernard through it in February, the same methodical sequence, the same precision, the same willingness to go back 1 page when a question required it. When Firth's counsel suggested that the analysis reflected a misunderstanding of standard fee structures by an inexperienced analyst, Sable turned to the specific subsection of the management agreement, read the relevant language aloud, explained the 3 ways it could be interpreted and the 1 way it had been applied, and asked counsel which interpretation he believed the 412 contributing employees had been given before they signed. Counsel did not answer. When Calloway's representative suggested that the junior analyst had been motivated by professional grievance following her treatment at the February meeting, Sable looked directly at the OSC panel, not at the representative, and said, "The documents were filed with the OSC 11 days before I resigned. The sequence is in the record." It was in the record. By mid-afternoon, Dale Firth's counsel had requested a recess. The recess lasted an hour. When the hearing resumed, Firth's firm had filed a consent agreement. The details were not public immediately, but Karen Vidal's expression when she returned to the room told Bernard Atchison what he needed to know. He looked across the table at Sable. He gave her a single, small nod. She looked back at the window. She allowed herself 1 breath. The $4.3 million in misfiled returns was ordered clawed back to the Hartwell Pension Fund with interest. The interest brought the total to just over $5 million. The process took 14 months. Every one of the 412 people received a letter. Most of them had no idea what it meant until they opened the attached statement and saw the corrected balance. One of those letters went to a woman named Adaze, a dietary aide who had worked at a Hartwell facility in Mississauga for 16 years. She opened the letter at her kitchen table on a Thursday evening while her daughter was doing homework beside her. She read it twice. Then she put it down and looked out the window for a while. Then she looked at her daughter and said, very quietly, "Someone found our money." Richard Calloway resigned from the managing partnership of Calloway Whitmore LLP 6 weeks after the hearing, citing personal reasons. His name was removed from the firm's website. Several of his long-standing client relationships ended in the months that followed. The Law Society of Ontario opened a conduct review. He retained his license narrowly on a finding of insufficient direct involvement, which satisfied no one, but was accurate in the technical sense. He moved his office. He took on smaller clients. He did not stop checking his watch, but the rooms where he checked it were quieter now. Dale Firth was permanently banned from acting as a portfolio manager or fund administrator by the OSC. The civil case brought by the Hartwell Board proceeded for 18 months. He settled. Bernard Atchison submitted his affidavit, attended the hearing, drove himself home afterward, and was back in his dining room by 7 that evening, eating soup he had made 2 days earlier, and rereading a document on a new pension case that had been forwarded to him by a contact in BC who had read about the Hartwell outcome in a regulatory newsletter. He thought about calling Sable, but decided she was probably busy. Joanne Leclerc was promoted to Director of Compliance at Mercer Capital Group within a year of the hearing. The first thing she did in the new position was rewrite the firm's protocol for junior analyst escalation. She made it shorter and she made it direct, and she added a clause specifying that senior partners of external firms did not have scheduling authority over internal meetings. It was a small clause. It mattered. And there was Comfort Osei, who heard the outcome of the hearing by phone, while she was on her break in the lobby of a building on Bay Street at 4:30 in the morning. She sat down on a bench near the security desk. She did not cry. She closed her eyes for a moment, and then she went back to work, because the shift wasn't finished. On a Saturday in May, Sable came home to the apartment on Danforth, the second-hand desk she had bought from a listing on Facebook Marketplace, and carried up 3 flights of stairs with help from the neighbor who had lent her the blazer. The blazer had been returned clean and pressed 2 weeks after the February meeting. The neighbor had waved it off and said, "Keep it, it suits you." Sable had folded it and placed it on the top shelf of the closet, where she could see it when she opened the door. The desk fit under the window. She put her laptop on it and her grandfather's clipping beside it, and a single coffee cup from Comfort's good set, the ceramic one with the small chip on the handle that nobody was allowed to throw away. She had 4 job offers pending. She hadn't opened any of them. There was no hurry. Outside the window, the maple tree on Danforth was fully green. The street below had its usual Saturday sound. Strollers, dogs, someone playing music from a car stopped at the light. Sable put her hands flat on the desk, the way she had learned to put her hands flat on tables when she needed to be still. In the tin above the refrigerator, the laminated clipping from 2009 was still there, but Comfort had added something beside it, a photocopy, trimmed carefully, of a single paragraph from the OSC's published notice of the Hartwell outcome. She had used the copier at the library on a Tuesday evening. She had folded it neatly and placed it in the tin without mentioning it. Sable found it a week later. The paragraph was not the headline. It was the third-to-last paragraph, the one that listed the source documentation. And near the bottom of the list, in plain typeface, it read, "Initial discrepancy identified by SOC, Mercer Capital Group, November Audit Review." No title, no credential, no age listed. Just the name and what she found. There are 412 people in Ontario today who go to work and come home and open their statements and see a number that is accurate because a woman of 26 sat on the floor of an apartment above a convenience store in February with her phone and a document that everyone else had decided was too complicated to question. Most of them have no idea she exists. She does not need them to. There is a grandmother somewhere who drove a cab for 20 years and sat at other people's kitchen tables for free because he believed that accuracy is a character, not a credential, and he passed that to his daughter and she passed it to hers. There is a compliance officer somewhere who pressed a business card into a stranger's hand in a lobby and then walked out of the building, which was small and cost nothing and changed everything. Real integrity does not announce itself in the rooms where it would be applauded. It tends to show up in the rooms where it is inconvenient, in borrowed blazers, before anyone has thought to invite it. The desk was second-hand. The coffee cup had a chip in the handle. The tree outside was green. Some mornings that's all a foundation needs to be. What stayed with me after I finished telling this story wasn't the hearing room. It wasn't even the number. $4.3 million, clawed back to 412 people who never knew it was missing. What stayed with me was the tin above the refrigerator. A small tin, a folded report card, a photograph of a woman standing in front of a house in Accra, and a laminated clipping about a man who drove a cab for 20 years and did free accounting for veterans on weekends because he believed the number doesn't care who found it. I think about that a lot. The idea that integrity isn't something you perform in rooms that are watching, it's something you practice in rooms that aren't. Sable's grandfather practiced it at other people's kitchen tables, for free for years, without a credential that matched his skill. Comfort practiced it in office buildings at 4 in the morning, bringing 2 coffees she couldn't really afford because her daughter was reading and reading mattered. Sable practiced it on the floor of an apartment above a convenience store, running the same calculation 5 different ways, not because someone was watching, but because she needed to be sure. That's the part I think we get wrong when we tell stories like this one. We look at the 47 minutes Sable spent dismantling Firth's case in front of an OSC panel, and we call that the moment. But the moment was actually 11 months earlier, when a junior analyst in a borrowed blazer decided to keep looking at a document that everyone else had agreed was boilerplate. The hearing was just the room finally catching up to what she already knew. There's a version of this story where Sable walks away, where Calloway's dismissal lands the way it was designed to land, where the computational concerns get quietly buried in an internal process, and 412 people retire into a future that's several $1,000s smaller than it should have been. That version exists. It happens constantly in companies and boardrooms and institutions where the person who finds the problem is younger or newer or wearing a borrowed blazer, and the person who benefits from the problem has 30 years and a gold cufflink and a roommate on the right side of the industry. What changed the outcome wasn't luck. It was that Sable had built something over years that couldn't be dismissed by one man's calendar management. She had the accuracy which she had developed not because it was required of her, but because she understood it as a form of honesty. She had the persistence to sit with an uncomfortable finding for 3 days before she said anything, and then to spend 3 weeks preparing the case in her own time on her own floor after she already had the evidence. And she had the integrity to file the documents with the OC before she resigned, not after, so that the sequence was clean and the record spoke for itself. Those 3 things together: the rigor to find what others miss, the grit to carry it forward when the institution tries to absorb it, and the honesty to do it without calculating what it costs you personally. That's what actually moves outcomes, not one dramatic moment. The whole quiet architecture underneath it. Bernard said it best without meaning to when he quoted Sable's grandfather: "Accuracy is a character, not a credential." I've been thinking about that ever since. If this story stayed with you, pass it to someone who's been told their findings are above their pay grade. Sometimes the most important thing in the room is the person nobody remembered to invite.